On a stormy night outside a forgotten hospital, a tiny cry pierces the darkness. A newborn, abandoned, helpless, shivering in the cold. But fate is watching, and so is she. A woman whose heart is too big to turn away. What begins as a moment of compassion unravels into a web of mystery, danger, and an unbreakable bond that will change lives forever. Love, sacrifice, and the fight for justice. This is a story you won't forget. Are you ready to listen? If you love powerful stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Your support means the world to us. The night was dark and cold, the kind that made people hurry home without looking back. Rain poured heavily, washing the empty streets in a dull silver sheen. The wind howled through the alleyways, rattling signboards and slamming against the hospital doors like a desperate visitor seeking refuge. The hospital itself was quiet. Inside, doctors and nurses moved through dimly lit hallways, their faces weary from long shifts. But outside, just beyond the bright emergency room lights, stood an old, forgotten doorway. It was rarely used anymore, a side entrance hidden in shadows where broken tiles and peeling paint whispered of neglect. And there in the freezing rain lay a baby, a tiny bundle wrapped in a thin, damp cloth. The fragile form shivered, barely moving, its breath uneven. A soft, desperate cry pierced the air, a weak, heartbreaking sound, swallowed almost instantly by the roaring storm. No one heard. The rain poured harder. Water pooled beneath the bundle, seeping through the cloth, stealing warmth from the helpless child. The tiny fingers twitched, curling inward, as if grasping for something, someone. Then, for a moment, silence. The cry faded. The baby's chest rose and fell unsteadily. Would anyone come? Would anyone notice? Or was this tiny soul destined to slip into the night, lost forever? The rain did not stop. The night did not care. But fate had other plans. The rain had not stopped. It pounded against the pavement in thick, heavy drops, drumming against rooftops, windows, and cars. The wind howled, sending shivers down the spine of anyone caught outside. Inside the hospital, the hum of machines and the low voices of night shift nurses filled the corridors. But none of them knew that just outside, in the forgotten doorway, a life was hanging by a thread. But she heard it. Amara had just ended her shift. She was exhausted, her legs aching from hours of standing, her back stiff from bending over patients all day. She worked in the pediatric ward, tending to children who needed care, love, and attention. And yet, despite the long hours and the overwhelming workload, Amara never regretted choosing this path. Tonight, however, she was more tired than usual. The day had been emotionally draining. Watching a mother break down in tears when her child was diagnosed with a chronic illness, holding the hand of a frightened little girl before surgery, comforting a father who had just learned his son would need long-term treatment. Amara sighed as she buttoned up her coat and slung her bag over her shoulder. She was ready to go home, to crawl into bed and shut the world out for a few hours. Then she heard it, a cry. Soft, weak, almost drowned by the storm, but unmistakably there. She stopped in her tracks, her heart suddenly pounding. Amara turned her head slightly, listening. The rain slapped against the pavement, the wind moaned through the trees, and then there it was again, a faint, fragile wail, as if whoever was crying had no more strength left. Her pulse quickened. Where was it coming from? She turned back toward the hospital's entrance, but the sound wasn't coming from there. It was farther away, near the side of the building, the old, unused doorway. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up. She rushed toward the sound, her shoes splashing through puddles as she stepped out in the rain. The cold was immediate, biting through her coat and sending chills down her spine. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't stop. As she neared the side entrance, she saw it. A bundle. So small, so still. Amara's breath caught in her throat as she dropped to her knees. The rain had already soaked through the thin cloth wrapped around the baby. The tiny face was pale, lips trembling, eyes barely open. The skin felt cold beneath her fingertips, too cold. "Oh my God," she whispered. The baby was barely clinging to life. Panic surged through her, followed immediately by instinct. She needed to get the baby inside. Now. Gently but urgently, she scooped up the fragile bundle, cradling it against her chest. The baby whimpered, the sound weaker than before. Amara's heart clenched. "Shh, you're okay. You're safe now," she murmured, but she knew that wasn't true yet. She ran. Her wet shoes squeaked against the hospital tiles as she rushed through the emergency entrance. The moment she stepped inside, warm air hit her, but the baby was still freezing in her arms. A nurse at the front desk looked up, startled. "Amara, what? No time! Get a doctor!" Amara's voice was urgent, commanding. She didn't care that her clothes were dripping wet or that her hair was plastered to her forehead. The only thing that mattered was the tiny life in her arms. The nurse's eyes widened. She reached for the nearest phone, calling for help. Within seconds, a doctor and two nurses appeared. Amara carefully placed the baby onto a gurney as they took over. The infant was rushed down the hall, disappearing into a treatment room. Amara stood there, frozen. Her hands trembled. Her clothes clung to her skin, drenched and cold, but she didn't move. Who would abandon a baby like that? Outside, in the rain, alone. A deep ache settled in her chest, a pain she couldn't explain. And then something inside her shifted. She had to know more. She had to understand why. She had to make sure the baby would be okay, even though she had no idea that this one moment, this one night, was about to change her life forever. Amara paced outside the emergency treatment room, her arms wrapped around herself. Though she was still soaked from the rain, she barely felt the cold. Her mind was spinning. The image of the baby, so tiny, so helpless, was burned into her thoughts. She glanced toward the doors, wishing she could see what was happening inside. The baby had barely made a sound as the doctors rushed it away. That silence haunted her. The hallway was eerily quiet. The night shift had slowed things down, with only a few nurses moving between rooms. The beeping of distant monitors filled the space, but it wasn't enough to drown out the storm still raging outside. Who could do such a thing? Abandoning a baby in the cold, in the rain? Amara shook her head, anger rising within her. There was no excuse for this. No explanation could justify leaving a defenseless child to die alone. Just then, the door swung open. Dr. Mensah, one of the senior pediatricians, stepped out. His expression was unreadable, but Amara could see the tension in his eyes. "How is the baby?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Dr. Mensah sighed. "Weak, but stable. Severe hypothermia, dehydrated, malnourished." He shook his head. Who knows how long the child was out there? A few hours more, and it would have been too late. A shiver ran through Amara. If she hadn't heard that faint cry, "What happens now?" she asked. "The baby will be placed in an incubator for warmth. We've started IV fluids, but there's something else." Amara frowned. "What?" Dr. Mensah hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "The baby shows signs of prior care." "What do you mean?" "The umbilical cord was cut properly. Whoever abandoned the child didn't just give birth and leave it. The baby was wrapped, poorly, yes, but someone at least tried to cover it." He exhaled. "And the child isn't a newborn. I'd estimate at least a week old." A week. That meant someone had been caring for the baby before deciding to leave it in the rain. Amara's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. She bit her lip. Are there any signs of abuse? No physical injuries, no bruises, but the baby is severely underfed. Amara's thoughts raced. If there were no bruises, no injuries, but still clear neglect, then maybe the person who left the baby had struggled to care for it. Maybe they hadn't wanted to let go, but something forced them to. Her gut told her there was more to this. She turned to Dr. Mensah. "Will the police be involved?" "They have to be. Abandoning a baby is a criminal offense." Amara swallowed hard. She wasn't sure why, but something about this didn't feel like a simple case of neglect. A nurse approached with a clipboard. "Dr. Mensah, we need you." He nodded and turned back to Amara. "You should go home. Get some rest." But Amara wasn't leaving. Not yet. She needed to see the baby. 15 minutes later, she stood inside the neonatal unit, staring through the glass at the tiny form lying in the incubator. The baby's skin was still pale, but there was a steady rise and fall of the chest, alive. For now. For now. Amara exhaled and stepped closer. The baby's fingers twitched slightly as if sensing her presence. A lump formed in her throat. Why did she feel this way? Why did she feel like she had a responsibility toward this child? She didn't even know the baby's name. Then again, maybe there wasn't one. Her heart ached at the thought. She pressed her hand lightly against the glass. "Who left you out there?" she whispered. "And why?" A deep voice answered behind her. "That's what we intend to find out." She turned quickly. A man stood there, tall, serious, dressed in a dark suit. His eyes were sharp, assessing her in a way that made her tense. He pulled out a badge. "Detective Kalu," he said, "I need to ask you some questions." The storm outside raged on, and inside, a different kind of storm was just beginning. Amara's breath caught as she stared at the detective. His presence was commanding, his sharp eyes unreadable. "What kind of questions?" she asked, her voice steady but her hands curling into fists. Detective Kalu tucked his badge into his jacket. "You're the one who found the baby, correct?" She nodded. He studied her carefully. "Why were you near that doorway at that exact moment?" Amara crossed her arms. "I was leaving after my shift when I heard the baby crying." His gaze didn't waver. "And you just happened to hear it in the middle of a storm?" Anger flared inside her. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this?" The detective remained calm. "I'm just gathering facts. A baby is left outside in the cold. You find it. That makes you a key witness." Witness. The word tasted strange in her mouth. Amara exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. "I work in the pediatric ward. I care about children. That's why I ran to help." Detective Kalu nodded slightly. "I don't doubt that." He glanced at the incubator. "Do you know if the hospital has cameras near that entrance?" Amara frowned. "No one really uses that doorway anymore. If there were cameras, they probably haven't worked in years." The detective sighed. "That complicates things." She hesitated before asking, "Do you think the mother will come back for the baby?" Detective Kalu's expression darkened. "Most cases like this? No, but something doesn't add up here. A baby abandoned after a week? Left near a hospital instead of a random street? It feels deliberate, almost like someone wanted the child to be found." Amara's stomach twisted. The detective gave her another long look. "If you remember anything, even the smallest detail, call me." He handed her a card before walking away, his footsteps heavy with purpose. Amara stared down at the card. Detective Uchenna Kalu, Special Crimes Division. She closed her eyes briefly. This wasn't just a case of a desperate mother leaving a child behind. There was something deeper, something hidden, and it unsettled her. She finally went home, but sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the baby's tiny face, the trembling fingers, the helpless cry. And with each thought, another memory crept in, one she had spent years trying to bury. A different baby, a different time. Her hands clenched into the sheets. She had been 14 when her mother sat her down and told her the truth. She had a sister, an older sister no one spoke about. A sister who had been given away as a baby, taken from their mother's arms before she was even old enough to understand. The reason? Poverty, desperation. Her mother had whispered the words with tears in her eyes. "I didn't want to let her go, but I had no choice." That story had haunted Amara her entire life. Now, standing in the middle of her dimly lit bedroom, she felt that same ache all over again. The baby she had found, was their mother also forced to let go? Was she watching from somewhere, heartbroken but helpless? Or was it something much, much worse? She didn't know, but she intended to find out. The next morning, Amara was back at the hospital. She barely had time to take a sip of coffee before Dr. Mensah pulled her aside. "The baby has a fever," he said grimly. "It's not unexpected given the exposure, but we need to be careful. Any delay in treatment could be dangerous." Amara's heart clenched. "Will the baby survive?" Dr. Mensah hesitated. "We're doing everything we can." That wasn't the answer she wanted. Determined, she went to the neonatal unit. The baby lay in the incubator, looking even smaller than before. The monitor beeped steadily, but the child's breaths were shallow. Amara touched the glass, feeling helpless. "You have to fight," she whispered. "Please." The baby didn't respond, but something inside Amara did. She wasn't walking away from this. She had lost a sister before. She wasn't losing this child too, no matter what it took. Amara stood in the neonatal unit, staring at the fragile baby through the incubator's glass. Every slow breath, every faint rise and fall of that tiny chest sent a ripple of emotions through her. The fever hadn't broken yet. Dr. Mensah's words echoed in her mind. Any delay in treatment could be dangerous. She had seen babies fight for their lives before. Some survived, some didn't. But this time it felt personal. Too personal. As she stood there, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're spending a lot of time here." She turned. Nurse Halima, one of the senior nurses, stood with her arms folded. There was a hint of suspicion in her eyes. Amara sighed. "I'm just worried." Halima nodded slowly, but didn't leave. This baby's case has stirred a lot of attention. The hospital board is already involved. That caught Amara off guard. The board? Halima glanced at the incubator, then lowered her voice. The child was abandoned outside our hospital. That means there will be legal issues, reports, investigations, and some people don't like complications. Amara frowned. What are you saying? Halima hesitated, then sighed. I heard whispers that child welfare might take the baby out of the hospital as soon as the condition stabilizes. A cold wave washed over Amara. But the baby isn't even strong yet. Moving it too soon. Not our decision. Halima gave her a pointed look. Be careful, Amara. You're too attached. Amara clenched her jaw. She knew Halima was right, but how could she not care? She turned back to the baby, feverish, weak, alone, and now possibly at risk of being taken away before fully recovering. Amara refused to let that happen. She found Detective Kalu in the hospital corridor, flipping through his notebook. You're back, she said. He glanced up, still working the case. Amara hesitated, then asked, Any leads? Kalu closed the notebook. No one has come forward. No security footage. No witnesses, but he studied her. I did some digging. Her heartbeat quickened. And, he leaned in slightly, a woman matching the possible age and description of the baby's mother was seen near the hospital 2 nights ago. Amara's breath caught. Where? Kalu exhaled. Security footage from a store across the street. She was standing outside watching the hospital entrance, but she never went in. Amara's mind raced. Did you find her? No. She disappeared before the cameras caught a clear view of her face. Something about that made Amara uneasy. A mother watching the hospital, hesitant to go in. A baby abandoned shortly after. It felt intentional. Whoever she is, Kalu continued, she's scared, and she doesn't want to be found. Amara's fists tightened. Why? That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the mystery woman, standing outside the hospital, battling an impossible decision. Why did she leave the baby? Why did she wait a whole week before doing so? And most importantly, was she in danger? Amara sat up in bed, her chest tight with frustration. The hospital, the detective, even child welfare, no one was moving fast enough. The baby didn't have time for delays. She needed answers. And if no one else was going to find them, she would. Amara sat in the dimly lit hospital lounge, staring at the detective's card on the table. Her fingers traced the edges as her mind raced. The baby's fever hadn't broken. The mother had vanished, and now child welfare was threatening to take the baby before it was strong enough to survive outside hospital care. Everything was slipping out of her hands. She exhaled sharply. No, I won't let this happen. Determined, she reached for her phone and dialed Detective Kalu's number. He answered on the second ring. Amara? She didn't waste time. I need to see that security footage. A pause. That's not standard procedure. I don't care about procedure. You said the mother was seen outside the hospital. If I can recognize her, we can find her faster. Another pause. Then Kalu sighed. Meet me in 30 minutes. At the police station, Kalu led Amara to a small, cluttered office. A monitor sat on the desk. A grainy black and white video paused on the screen. That's her. He pointed to a hooded figure standing across the street from the hospital entrance. Amara leaned in, studying the woman. She was thin, her body wrapped in an oversized jacket. Her hands fidgeted in front of her, fingers twisting nervously. She looked up at the hospital, hesitated, then quickly turned away. A deep sense of sorrow settled in Amara's chest. She was afraid. Kalu tapped the screen. See that? Amara narrowed her eyes. In the background, barely noticeable, a dark-colored car was parked down the street. She wasn't alone, Kalu said. That car was there for over an hour, parked in the same spot. The moment she disappeared from the camera, the car drove off. A chill ran through Amara. Someone was watching her. Kalu nodded. That's my guess. Amara's pulse quickened. What if she didn't abandon the baby by choice? What if she was being forced? She turned to Kalu. We need to find her. Now. By morning, the baby's condition had worsened. The fever isn't breaking, Dr. Mensah said grimly. We need a full medical history to determine the best treatment. Without the mother, we're working blind. Amara swallowed hard. If they didn't act soon, the baby might not make it. She needed to find the mother before it was too late. Determined, she rushed to the hospital entrance and stared at the street. The woman had been here, watching, waiting. But where had she gone? A thought struck her. The only reason someone would hesitate outside a hospital was if they didn't feel safe going inside. What if she was hiding in plain sight? Amara's heart pounded as she made a decision. She grabbed her coat and stepped into the city streets, determined to search every shelter, every alley, every shadowed corner. She would find this woman, because now it wasn't just about saving a baby, it was about saving a mother too. Amara walked through the city streets, her coat pulled tightly around her against the morning chill. Every fiber of her being was focused on one goal, finding the baby's mother before it was too late. She passed busy marketplaces, street vendors shouting their morning prices and tired workers hurrying to their jobs. But she wasn't looking for them. She was searching for a woman in hiding. Her instincts led her to a cluster of run-down buildings near the outskirts of the city, a place where people went when they had nowhere else. Shelters, abandoned houses, hidden alleys. If the baby's mother was scared, she might have sought refuge here. Amara entered the first shelter, a small overcrowded space where women and children huddled together for warmth. She approached a volunteer. "I'm looking for someone," she said. A young woman, thin, probably wearing a hooded jacket. She might seem scared. The volunteer sighed. "That describes half the women here." Amara's stomach sank. She knew this wouldn't be easy. She moved to another shelter, then another, nothing. But then, outside the third shelter, she spotted a figure sitting on the curb. A young woman, hunched over, her jacket pulled tightly around her as if trying to disappear. Amara's breath caught. "It's her." Slowly, she approached. "Excuse me," she said softly. The woman flinched. Her head snapped up, revealing a pair of hollow, frightened eyes. Amara's heart clenched. "Please, I need to talk to you." The woman stood abruptly, ready to flee. Amara raised her hands. "Wait, I'm not here to hurt you." The woman hesitated, eyes darting around as if expecting someone to grab her. "My name is Amara," she continued gently. "I work at the hospital." At the word hospital, the woman's breath hitched. Amara took a careful step closer. "You left your baby there, didn't you?" Tears instantly filled the woman's eyes. Her body trembled. And then finally she whispered, "Is my baby alive?" Amara nodded. "Yes, but very sick. We need to know your baby's medical history to help." The woman let out a broken sob, covering her mouth. "What's your name?" Amara asked softly. The woman wiped her tears, voice shaking. "Naomi." "Naomi." Amara tested the name, hoping to ease the tension. "Can you tell me what happened? Why did you leave your baby?" Naomi hugged herself, eyes filled with terror. "I didn't want to. I had to." A bad feeling settled in Amara's gut. "Why?" Naomi glanced around, paranoid. Then she leaned in and whispered, "Because they're looking for me." Amara's breath caught. "Who?" Naomi gripped Amara's arm, her fingers ice cold. "They'll come for the baby too." The air around them grew heavy. Before Amara could ask anything else, a dark-colored car rolled slowly down the street. Naomi froze, her face drained of color. "Oh no!" The car stopped right in front of them. The back window rolled down, just enough for a pair of cold, unreadable eyes to lock onto Naomi. Amara felt it immediately. They weren't safe. Naomi's lips parted in a silent gasp, and then she turned and ran. "Naomi, wait!" Amara called. But Naomi was already disappearing into the alleys, her thin frame swallowed by the city shadows. Amara's heart pounded. She was running for her life. She spun back toward the car, but the window was rolling up, concealing the mysterious figure inside. And then, just as silently as it had appeared, the car drove away, leaving Amara standing there, breathless, with more questions than ever before. Amara stood frozen in the street, her pulse pounding in her ears. The dark-colored car had disappeared, leaving only questions and a chilling fear in its wake. Naomi was gone. But Amara couldn't let this end here, not when the baby's life was still hanging by a thread. She pulled out her phone and dialed Detective Kalu's number. "She's alive," Amara said breathlessly the moment he answered. "The baby's mother. Her name is Naomi." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Where is she?" "She ran," Amara admitted. "But she's terrified, Kalu. Someone is after her. We need to find her before they do." A pause. Then Kalu's voice turned firm. "I'm on it." By the time Amara returned to the hospital, the baby's condition had worsened. Dr. Mensah shook his head. "The fever is still high. If we don't get answers soon..." Amara clenched her fists. "No, she won't lose this baby." She took a deep breath and approached the incubator. The baby looked so small, so helpless. Hold on, she whispered. I'm bringing your mother back. And she meant it. 2 hours later, her phone rang. Kalu's voice was urgent. We found her. Amara's chest tightened. Where? In an abandoned warehouse near the old railway station. But Amara, she's hurt. Cold fear gripped her. I'm coming. Amara arrived to find Naomi curled up in a corner, her clothes torn, her face bruised. Tears filled Amara's eyes as she knelt beside her. Naomi. Naomi looked up, her eyes filled with pain. They found me. Who? Naomi swallowed hard. My husband. Amara gasped. Husband? He was abusive, Naomi whispered. When I got pregnant, I knew I had to leave, but he found me. He said if I didn't come back, he would take the baby. Amara's stomach twisted. So you left the baby at the hospital to protect it. Tears streamed down Naomi's cheeks. I thought she'd be safer without me. Amara squeezed her hand. Naomi, your baby is sick. She needs you. Naomi sobbed. I want to see her. Amara smiled through her own tears. Then let's go. Back at the hospital, Naomi held her baby for the first time. Tears dripped onto the child's tiny face as Naomi whispered, I'm so sorry. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Dr. Mensah ran tests with Naomi's medical history, and soon the right treatment was administered. Hours later, the fever finally broke. Amara let out a shaky breath of relief. They had won. Days later, Naomi sat beside Amara, watching her baby sleep peacefully. I don't know how to thank you, Naomi said. You don't have to, Amara replied. A warm silence stretched between them before Naomi hesitated. I'm scared my husband will come back. Kalu stepped forward then, a confident smirk on his face. He won't. Naomi looked at him, confused. We arrested him, Kalu said simply. He won't be hurting you or your child ever again. Naomi covered her mouth, sobbing. Relief flooded her features, and she turned to Amara. What do I do now? She whispered. Amara took her hand. You start over, and this time you won't be alone. Naomi looked down at her child and smiled, truly smiled for the first time. The baby had a future now, a future filled with love, and so did Naomi.